The engines never stop. Across the frost-hardened plains of northeastern France, December 1944, a sound emerges that has no precedent in military history. Not the crack of rifles. Not the thunder of artillery. But something deeper. Something industrial. The low, relentless growl of 10,000 trucks moving as one organism, headlights extinguished, convoy discipline absolute, carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts across mud-choked roads that shouldn't exist. Inside a farmhouse 17 miles behind German lines, General Major Wilhelm von Schlieben studies a map by candlelight. His staff officers stand silent. The intelligence reports make no sense. American forces, entire divisions, are advancing faster than their supply lines should allow. Faster than Blitzkrieg. Faster than Napoleon. Von Schlieben traces his finger along the roads leading from Normandy to the Rhine. He calculates tonnage, fuel consumption, repair cycles. The numbers are impossible. They cannot sustain this, he says aloud, though no one has asked. No army can. But outside, in the frozen darkness, the trucks keep moving. This is not the war von Schlieben was trained to fight. Not the war his father fought in 1914, where horses pulled artillery through Belgian mud. Not even the war he himself waged in Poland and France, where speed meant mechanized columns racing ahead of fragile supply tethers. This is something else entirely. Something that violates every principle of German military doctrine. An army that moves faster because of its logistics, not despite them. 50 miles west, at a forward supply depot coded Red Ball Express Station 127, African-American truck drivers unload their fifth cargo run in 36 hours. No sleep. No rotation. Just motion. A young private from Alabama drains a canteen of cold coffee, wipes diesel from his hands, and climbs back behind the wheel. He doesn't know von Schlieben exists. Doesn't know that German officers are calling American logistics wasteful and inefficient in their reports to Berlin. He only knows the schedule. Cherbourg to the front. Front to Cherbourg. Repeat. The war ends when the trucks stop. They won't stop. Historians will call this the greatest logistical achievement in military history. But in December 1944, it's just sound. The sound of an industrial superpower learning to project power not through tactics or courage, though both exist in abundance, but through supply. Through the unglamorous, uncinematic science of moving 5,000 tons of material per day across a continent while the enemy's own logistics collapse into horse-drawn chaos. German generals mocked what they didn't understand. By spring, they would understand perfectly. September 1939. The German Wehrmacht storms across Poland with a new word on their lips, Blitzkrieg. Lightning war. Mechanized divisions, air support, and radio coordination moving faster than defending armies can react. The world watches in horror as Warsaw falls in 27 days. France, the great military power of Europe, collapses in 6 weeks. The Soviet Union loses entire army groups in a matter of months. German military doctrine, forged in the trenches of World War I and perfected in the interwar years, seems unstoppable. But there's a problem the newsreels don't show. Behind every panzer division racing toward Moscow or Paris, a fragile supply line stretches like a thread ready to snap. German logistics rely on railroads, efficient within Germany's borders, catastrophic beyond them. When tracks are destroyed, supplies stop. When locomotives break down, entire offensives stall. And when distances grow too great, horses, millions of horses, pull wagons through mud and snow, just as they did in 1914. The Wehrmacht enters World War II as a mechanized force and fights most of it with animals. In 1941, as German columns advance toward Stalingrad, over 750,000 horses serve in the Wehrmacht's logistics corps. They eat more food than the soldiers they supply. They die by the thousands in Russian winters. And they cannot keep pace with tanks. This is the war the German General Staff knows how to fight. Fast operational maneuvers followed by long, vulnerable pauses while supply lines catch up. It worked against smaller nations. It worked when railroads were intact. It works as long as the enemy fights the same kind of war. The United States does not fight the same kind of war. Across the Atlantic, a different philosophy is emerging. Not from military academies or Prussian war colleges, but from assembly lines. From Ford factories in Detroit. From oil refineries in Texas. From a civilian economy that produces more steel in a single year than all of Europe combined. American military planners don't ask, how fast can our tanks advance? They ask, how much fuel can we deliver to keep them advancing forever? The answer stuns even American commanders. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produces 88,410 tanks, 257,000 artillery pieces, 2.4 million trucks, 17 million rifles, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. These numbers don't represent military genius. They represent industrial capacity so vast that it rewrites the rules of warfare. German factories, bombed and overstretched, produce a fraction of this output. Soviet factories, evacuated and improvised, produce quantity without diversity. Only America produces everything, in surplus, and develops the logistics to move it anywhere on Earth. This is not the war German generals planned for. Not the war they studied at Staff College or practiced in peacetime exercises. This is a war where supply determines victory more than tactics. Where the side that can deliver 5 hot meals per soldier per day defeats the side that delivers 2. Where the army that wastes fuel on redundancy crushes the army that conserves fuel through necessity. And at the center of this logistical revolution stands a single operational concept, born from desperation and perfected through repetition: continuous supply. Not stockpiles. Not depots. But motion. Trucks that never stop moving. Convoys that operate 24 hours a day. A supply chain so relentless that forward units receive ammunition faster than they can fire it. German doctrine calls this wasteful. American doctrine calls this winning. By June 1944, as Allied forces storm Normandy's beaches, two philosophies of war are about to collide. One believes in operational brilliance constrained by logistics. The other believes logistics is the operation. One side sees trucks as tools. The other sees them as weapons. The German generals are about to learn the difference. And they will learn it while retreating. June 6, 1944. Normandy. The largest amphibious invasion in history crashes onto 5 beaches with 156,000 men, 5,000 ships, and 11,000 aircraft. Within 72 hours, Allied engineers are constructing artificial harbors, massive floating docks capable of unloading 7,000 tons of supplies per day. Within a week, fuel pipelines are being laid across the English Channel, pumping gasoline directly from British refineries to French battlefields. The scale is incomprehensible. But the German response is predictable. General Feld Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, studies intelligence reports with professional disdain. The Allies have landed. They will now attempt to break out from their beachhead. And when they do, their supply lines, stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, will become vulnerable. This is where Germany will counterattack. This is where operational brilliance will defeat industrial excess. Von Rundstedt has fought this war before. In Poland. In France. In Russia. The pattern is always the same: rapid enemy advance, overextended supply lines, then collapse. He has seen Soviet offensives grind to a halt when trucks run out of fuel. He has watched British columns retreat when ammunition runs low. The Americans, wealthy and confident, will make the same mistake. They will advance too fast, supply too little, and expose themselves to a killing blow. He is wrong about everything. By July, Allied forces have landed over 1 million men in France. But the breakthrough from Normandy proves slower than planned. Hedgerow country, dense, medieval terrain perfect for defense, turns every field into a battlefield. German resistance is fierce. Casualties mount. And then, on July 25, Operation Cobra detonates the stalemate with 1,500 heavy bombers carpet-bombing German positions in a single morning. The breakout begins. 3rd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., explodes through the gap. Within days, his armored divisions are racing across France at speeds that violate every logistics manual ever written. 40 miles in a day. then 60, then 80. German commanders, expecting Patton to halt and resupply, watch in disbelief as his columns keep moving. How is this possible? The answer is rolling westward at 30 miles per hour on 10,000 wheels. Behind Patton's advance, a supply operation begins that has no historical parallel. The Red Ball Express, a dedicated truck convoy system, starts moving fuel, ammunition, and rations from Normandy beaches to forward units in non-stop relays. Drivers, predominantly African-American soldiers from segregated quartermaster units, operate in shifts that ignore peacetime safety regulations. 20 hours behind the wheel. 4 hours of sleep. Repeat. No convoys stop. If a truck breaks down, it's pushed off the road. The cargo is transferred. The convoy keeps moving. In a single day, Red Ball Express trucks move 12,342 tons of supplies. The German logistics system, at its peak efficiency in 1940, moved less than half that amount across shorter distances with intact railroads. Patton's army is being fed by a supply chain that operates like a factory assembly line, constant, predictable, and unstoppable. German intelligence officers receive these numbers and dismiss them as propaganda. No army moves this fast on trucks alone. Rail transport is required. Depots are required. Rest is required. The Americans must be exaggerating, or their advance will soon collapse under its own weight. But Patton's tanks are not slowing down. By mid-August, Third Army has advanced over 400 miles in less than a month, deeper into France than the German army penetrated in the entire 1940 campaign. Entire German divisions, cut off and surrounded, surrender without firing a shot. Their supply lines, dependent on horses and damaged railroads, cannot adapt to the speed of the American advance. Wehrmacht units retreat so fast they abandon fuel depots, ammunition stores, and even functioning tanks. Not because they're defeated in battle, but because they cannot supply what they still possess. In his headquarters, now relocated to a safer position further east, von Rundstedt reads the casualty reports with growing comprehension. This is not a tactical defeat. This is not even an operational defeat. This is something worse, a systemic defeat. The Americans have built a war machine that doesn't fight the way wars are supposed to be fought. They don't maneuver for advantage. They don't seek decisive battles. They just push. Constantly. Relentlessly. Supplied by a logistics network so robust that it absorbs losses, adapts to chaos, and never stops feeding the advance. One of his staff officers, a veteran of the Eastern Front, speaks the unthinkable aloud: they fight like Bolsheviks. But with American trucks. Von Rundstedt does not reply. Outside, in the August heat, the sound of Allied aircraft overhead has become constant. Supply planes. Transport planes. Fighter bombers protecting supply columns. Even the air belongs to the Americans now. And below, on every road leading east, the trucks keep moving. German commanders still believe they can win this war. They are about to discover they've already lost it. To understand what's happening in France in August 1944, you must look backward, not to 1939, but to 1917. When the United States entered World War I, American forces arrived in Europe with enthusiasm and almost no logistical infrastructure. Soldiers fought with French rifles, British artillery, and borrowed uniforms. Supply chaos reigned. Units went days without rations. Artillery batteries ran out of shells mid-battle. The experience humiliated American military planners and taught them a lesson they would never forget. Wars are not won by brave men with rifles. They are won by systems that keep those men fed, armed, and moving. In the interwar years, while Germany perfected blitzkrieg tactics and the Soviet Union built massive tank armies, the U.S. military did something less glamorous. It studied supply. Quartermasters analyzed railroad capacity. Engineers designed portable bridges. Logistics officers calculated fuel consumption rates for mechanized divisions. And civilian industry, Ford, General Motors, Standard Oil, began developing supply systems that could scale from peacetime production to total war mobilization. Few people today realize that America's greatest weapon in World War II was not designed in a weapons lab. It was designed in a factory. The GMC CCKW, better known as the Jimmy or Deuce and a Half, was a 2.5-ton cargo truck that could carry 5,000 pounds of supplies across mud, sand, or bombed-out roads. It could be repaired with basic tools. Parts were interchangeable. Drivers could be trained in days. And American factories, operating 3 shifts per day, produced 562,750 of them between 1941 and 1945. More than 500,000 trucks. Enough to supply an entire continental campaign. But trucks alone don't win wars. You need fuel, and food, and ammunition, and spare parts, and mechanics, and roads, and depots, and coordination systems to ensure that the right supplies reach the right units at the right time. The German military, brilliant at tactics, never solved this puzzle at scale. The Soviet military solved it through brutal simplification, mass-produced weapons, minimal variety, and a logistics system that accepted catastrophic inefficiency. The American military solved it through integration. Here's what that meant in practice. Every American division in Europe consumed, on average, 650 tons of supplies per day. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, mail, replacement parts. An armored division consumed even more, up to 800 tons per day when engaged in heavy combat. Multiply that by dozens of divisions, spread across hundreds of miles, and you reach a staggering figure. By autumn 1944, Allied forces in Europe were consuming over 20,000 tons of supplies per day. The German Wehrmacht, at the height of its power in 1941, consumed roughly 15,000 tons per day across the entire Eastern Front. And most of that moved by rail or horse. American logistics moved by truck. And the trucks never stopped. This required a revolution in organizational thinking. The U.S. Army developed a system called continuous supply, where supplies flowed like a river rather than accumulating in depots. Forward units didn't wait for supply convoys to arrive. They expected them, on schedule, like a factory expects raw materials. If a convoy was late, backup convoys were already en route. If a depot was bombed, alternate depots existed. If a bridge was destroyed, engineers had already constructed a replacement 3 miles upstream. German military philosophy, rooted in Auftragstaktik, mission-type orders, empowered field commanders to make tactical decisions independently. American military philosophy, rooted in industrial systems thinking, empowered logistics officers to make supply decisions independently. Both systems worked. But only one could sustain a multi-year, multi-continent offensive without collapsing. And then there was fuel. In 1944, American forces in Europe consumed over 300,000 gallons of gasoline per day. To deliver this, the U.S. military constructed Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, a series of underwater pipelines stretching from Britain to France, pumping fuel directly to forward supply depots. When pipelines couldn't reach far enough, engineers built portable pipelines that could be laid alongside advancing armies at a rate of 20 miles per day. When even that wasn't fast enough, trucks carried jerrycans, millions of them, 5 gallons each, stackable and durable. Germany, by contrast, was running out of fuel. Romanian oil fields had been bombed. Synthetic fuel plants were under constant air attack. Panzer divisions, immobilized by fuel shortages, were abandoned in place. Luftwaffe fighters sat grounded on airfields because there was no aviation fuel to fly them. By late 1944, German military effectiveness was being strangled not by Allied tactics, but by Allied abundance. This is the invisible war. The war fought in supply depots and truck maintenance bays and fuel pipeline construction sites. The war where victory is measured not in territory captured, but in tons delivered. The war that German generals, trained to think in terms of operational maneuvers and decisive battles, never understood until it was too late. Because here's the truth they couldn't accept: the United States wasn't fighting a European war. It was fighting a global war, simultaneously, on 2 fronts, supplying allies on 3 continents, while maintaining a civilian economy that produced more consumer goods in 1943 than it had in 1939. American industrial output in World War II exceeded the combined output of all Axis powers by a factor of 2 to 1. In steel production, it was 3 to 1. In oil production, it was 5 to 1. These numbers don't inspire fear when you read them in a textbook. But when you're a German field commander watching American tanks advance without stopping, watching American aircraft fly constant sorties, watching American artillery fire shells that seem limitless, these numbers become existential terror. The engines never stop. And now, in late summer 1944, they're moving east. September 1944. The Seine River. For the first time since D-Day, George Patton's Third Army pauses. Not because of German resistance. Wehrmacht forces are in full retreat. Not because of casualties. Allied losses, while significant, are sustainable. Patton's army stops because it has run out of fuel. This is the moment German commanders have been waiting for. In bunkers and command posts across eastern France and western Germany, Wehrmacht staff officers study maps with renewed hope. The Americans have overextended. Their supply lines, stretched across 400 miles of liberated territory, have finally snapped. Now comes the counterattack. Now comes the reversal. All German forces need is time. Time to regroup, time to fortify defensive positions, time to bring up reserves. If the American pause lasts 2 weeks, Germany can stabilize the Western Front. If it lasts a month, they might even retake lost ground. The pause lasts 8 days. On September 5th, fuel trucks reach Patton's forward units. By September 8th, Third Army is moving again. Not at full strength, fuel remains tight, but moving nonetheless. The German counteroffensive that was supposed to exploit American vulnerability never materializes. Because by the time German forces concentrate for an attack, the Americans have already advanced beyond the planned strike zone. This is when the revelation begins to crystallize in Wehrmacht command. The Americans don't need to be operationally brilliant. They just need to keep moving. Even at reduced speed, even with logistical constraints, they advance faster than Germany can respond. It's not tactics. It's tempo. But something else is happening. Something the German General Staff, fixated on grand strategy and operational maneuvers, has completely failed to anticipate. The French railroad system is being rebuilt. Every mile of rail line the Allies capture, American engineers repair. Bombed bridges are replaced with prefabricated Bailey bridges, portable, steel truss structures that can be assembled in hours and support 60-ton loads. Destroyed rail yards are cleared by bulldozers and restored to operation within days. Captured locomotives are refueled and pressed into service. And behind the front lines, an entirely new logistics network is emerging, one that combines trucks for speed with trains for volume. By October, Allied supply trains are running from Normandy to Nancy, France, over 300 miles, delivering 5,000 tons of supplies per day in addition to truck convoys. The Red Ball Express, which had been straining to meet demand, now shares the burden with rail transport. The pause that German commanders hoped would cripple the Allied advance instead becomes a transition, from a truck-dependent supply system to a hybrid truck and rail system that can sustain operations indefinitely. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, reads the intelligence reports with a sinking realization. The Americans are not retreating. They are consolidating. Every day they spend paused is a day spent building infrastructure that will make their next advance even faster. The logistical weakness Germany hoped to exploit is being eliminated in real time. And then, in late September, something happens that should be impossible. Operation Market Garden, the Allied airborne assault into the Netherlands, fails. British paratroopers, dropped behind German lines to seize key bridges, are surrounded and forced to withdraw. The operation, intended to open a direct route into Germany's industrial heartland, ends in costly failure. Strategically, it's a disaster. Politically, it's an embarrassment. But logistically, the Allies barely notice. Because while Market Garden collapses in the north, American forces continue advancing in the south. Patton's Third Army pushes toward Metz. The U.S. 7th Army drives into Alsace-Lorraine. The supply network that fed Market Garden simply redirects to other fronts. Trucks that would have supplied British airborne divisions instead supply American infantry divisions. Fuel that would have gone to Arnhem goes to Saarbrücken. The system adapts, compensates, and continues. This is the moral revelation that breaks German strategic thinking. The Allies can afford to fail. A single disastrous operation, one that would cripple Wehrmacht logistics for months, is absorbed by the American supply system as a minor setback. There is no crisis, no emergency reallocation of scarce resources, no desperate gambles to salvage a deteriorating situation. The Allies simply move to the next operation, fully supplied, without missing a beat. In his memoirs, written years after the war, General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin will recall this moment with brutal clarity. "We had always believed that if we could destroy their spearheads, the Americans would be forced to pause and regroup. But they had so many spearheads, and so much supply, that losing one simply meant they advanced with another. It was not war as we understood it. It was industrialized attrition, and we had no answer." By early October, German forces have retreated to the Siegfried Line, the fortified defensive barrier along Germany's western border. Here, finally, they will make their stand. Here, behind concrete bunkers and minefields and anti-tank obstacles, they will stop the American advance. They are correct. The advance does stop. For 6 weeks. And then, in mid-November, it resumes. Stronger than before. Because the trucks are still moving. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. At 5:30 a.m., in darkness and fog, 200,000 German soldiers launched the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's desperate gamble to split Allied forces, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Reich collapses entirely. The initial assault is devastating. Entire American divisions, Green troops, recently arrived, stationed in a quiet sector, are overrun. German tanks, concealed by fog and forest, break through defensive lines. Paratroopers in American uniforms infiltrate Allied positions, cutting communication lines and spreading chaos. Within 48 hours, German forces have advanced 30 miles, creating a bulge in Allied lines that threatens to envelope 2 entire U.S. corps. This is the Battle of the Bulge. And for the first 72 hours, it looks like a catastrophe. But something strange happens. The American response is not panic. It's acceleration. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower orders 2 actions simultaneously. First, reinforce the Ardennes. Second, keep supplying everyone else. No reallocation from other fronts. No emergency supply cuts. Just add the Ardennes to the existing logistics plan and execute. Within 24 hours, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, elite units resting behind the lines, are trucked to the Ardennes and deployed as infantry. Not airlifted. Not carefully positioned. Just loaded onto trucks and driven straight into the battle zone. No other army in history could redeploy 2 full divisions this quickly. The Germans, still dependent on rail transport and horse-drawn supply wagons, would need 2 weeks to accomplish the same movement. Patton, commanding 3rd Army to the south, receives orders to disengage from his current offensive and pivot north to relieve surrounded American forces at Bastogne. His staff officers stare at the map in disbelief. Pivoting an entire army, 90,000 men, 25,000 vehicles, spread across 50 miles of front, is a maneuver that requires days of planning. Patton promises to do it in 48 hours. He does it in 36. 3 divisions, 4th Armored, 26th Infantry, 80th Infantry, disengage under fire, march 90 miles through snow and ice, and attack German positions from an unexpected direction. This should be impossible. Units this size, moving this fast, should collapse into logistical chaos. But the supply trucks are already there, prepositioned along the march route, delivering fuel and ammunition before forward units even request it. Patton's tanks arrive at Bastogne not depleted and exhausted, but combat-ready and fully supplied. The German offensive, designed to exploit Allied supply vulnerabilities, has instead exposed Germany's own. Panzer divisions, racing westward in the opening days of the offensive, outrun their own fuel supplies. Tanks roll to a halt 3 miles from critical fuel depots, Allied depots, fully stocked, which German forces can't capture because they've run out of fuel to reach them. Irony becomes operational reality. Some panzer units are destroyed while stationary, waiting for fuel trucks that never arrive. Others are abandoned by their crews, who retreat on foot. By December 26th, the German advance has stalled. Not stopped by superior tactics or overwhelming firepower, but by absence. Absence of fuel. Absence of ammunition. Absence of food. German soldiers, promised they would feast on captured American supplies, instead starve in frozen foxholes while American forces, supplied by uninterrupted truck convoys, eat hot meals and fire artillery barrages so dense they turn forests into ash. At the town of Bastogne, surrounded by German forces, the 101st Airborne holds for 6 days. Luftwaffe aircraft drop some supplies, but not enough. Wehrmacht commanders expect the Americans to surrender. They send a formal demand: capitulate or be annihilated. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe replies with a single word: nuts. He can afford defiance. Because American supply planes are overhead, dropping ammunition and medical supplies by parachute. Because Patton's tanks are 12 miles away and closing. Because every American soldier in that frozen perimeter knows, with absolute certainty, that supply trucks are coming. They arrive on December 27th. The Bulge doesn't just collapse. It reverses. German forces, now exposed and undersupplied, retreat faster than they advanced. Allied air power, grounded during the initial foggy days, returns with brutal efficiency. Fighter bombers strafe retreating columns. Heavy bombers obliterate rail junctions. Supply depots disappear in fireballs. And the roads, those vital German roads, built for military logistics, become killing zones. By mid-January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge is over. Germany has lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and the last mobile reserves capable of defending the Reich. The offensive, intended to shatter Allied momentum, instead exhausts Germany's final strategic reserves while barely slowing the American advance. Allied casualties are higher. Allied tank losses are severe. But Allied logistics remain intact. The trucks keep moving. The supplies keep flowing. And within weeks, American forces are advancing again, toward the Rhine, toward Berlin, toward the end. In his bunker in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler screams at his generals about betrayal and cowardice. But the truth is simpler and more terrible. Germany lost the Battle of the Bulge not on the battlefield, but in the factory. In the convoy. In the supply depot. They lost it before the first shot was fired. Because the Americans could afford to be surprised. And Germany could not afford to be stopped. February 1945. The Rhine River. Snow melts into mud. The Ardennes offensive is memory now, catalogued in casualty reports and captured equipment inventories. German forces retreat behind the Rhine, the last natural barrier before the industrial heart of the Reich. They blow bridges as they withdraw. Every crossing destroyed. Every ford mined. Every riverbank fortified. If the Allies want Germany, they will have to cross one of the most defensible rivers in Europe. It takes the Allies 3 weeks. On March 7th, American forces capture the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, intact, by accident, because German demolition charges fail to fully detonate. Within 24 hours, 8,000 American soldiers are across the Rhine. Within a week, 5 divisions have crossed. The bridge collapses on March 17th, but by then it doesn't matter. Engineers have already constructed pontoon bridges alongside it. Supplies are flowing. Tanks are across. The war is over in everything but formality. But this is not what breaks the German General Staff psychologically. They expected the Rhine to be crossed eventually. What breaks them is how it's crossed. At Wesel, in late March, British and American forces conduct a combined amphibious and airborne assault across the Rhine. Over 16,000 paratroopers drop behind German lines while infantry cross in amphibious vehicles. The operation involves 3,000 artillery pieces firing preparatory barrages, 1,500 transport aircraft, and 10,000 support vehicles. It succeeds with minimal casualties. And it's redundant. Because by the time the Wesel crossing happens, 5 other crossings have already been established. The Allies aren't crossing at one point and exploiting a breakthrough. They're crossing everywhere simultaneously. Remagen, Oppenheim, Boppard, Worms, Mainz. Each crossing supplied independently. Each supported by its own logistics network. Each capable of sustaining an advance without relying on the others. German commanders watch this unfold and realize the final truth. they are not fighting an army. They are fighting a system. A system so large, so redundant, so over-resourced that it doesn't need brilliance to win. It just needs to exist. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, architect of German armored doctrine, writes in his diary, "We taught the world how to use tanks. But the Americans taught the world how to supply them. And in the end, supply mattered more." By April, Allied forces are advancing at speeds that exceed even the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1940. Not because of tactical innovation, though tactics remain effective, but because there is no resistance left that can't be overcome by more. More fuel. More ammunition. More replacements. More tanks. The Wehrmacht, bled dry by 5 years of attrition warfare, can no longer concentrate forces to defend anything. They retreat, fight delaying actions, and retreat again. And behind them, American supply convoys advance like a rising tide. The human cost of this mechanical precision becomes visible in displaced persons camps and ruined cities. German civilians, fleeing westward, clog roads that American trucks need. Refugees starve beside supply depots overflowing with rations. The moral complexity of total war asserts itself. The system that feeds Allied armies has no mechanism to feed enemy civilians. Abundance and deprivation exist side by side, separated by national identity and military necessity. American soldiers see this. Truck drivers hauling fuel past starving children. Quartermaster units guarding supply dumps while towns burn. The cognitive dissonance is profound. They are liberators and conquerors simultaneously. They bring both salvation and destruction. And they do it efficiently. By late April, Soviet forces reach Berlin from the east. American and British forces advance into central Germany from the west. Germany, squeezed between two industrial superpowers, collapses. Not in a final climactic battle, but in 1,000 small surrenders. Units lay down weapons. Officers negotiate local ceasefires. Soldiers walk home. The war ends not with a bang but with exhaustion. Exhaustion so total that continuing seems absurd. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrenders unconditionally. The Third Reich, which promised 1,000 years, lasted 12. In the final accounting, American industrial production, just the vehicles alone, deployed over 2.5 million trucks in the European theater. The Red Ball Express, at its peak, moved 12,000 tons per day. Total Allied supply operations delivered over 18 million tons of material to European battlefields between June 1944 and May 1945. The German Wehrmacht, at its peak logistical efficiency, moved a fraction of this. And that's why Germany lost. Not because their soldiers were less brave. Not because their tanks were inferior. Not even because their strategy was flawed. They lost because they never understood that modern war is not won by the army that fights best. It's won by the army that supplies longest. The engines fall silent. The trucks are parked. But the lesson remains. 79 years later, the trucks sit in museums. Carefully restored GMC CCKWs, painted olive drab, preserved behind velvet ropes. Tourists photograph them. Historians explain their specifications. 2.5 tons cargo capacity. 4-wheel drive. 91.5 horsepower. These numbers mean nothing to most visitors. Just machinery. Just relics of a war long ended. But if you listen, if you truly pay attention, you can still hear them. Not the engines. Not the diesel growl or the grinding gears. Something else. The sound of a lesson that history keeps trying to teach and humanity keeps failing to learn. Wars are not won by heroes. They are won by systems. The German generals who mocked American logistics were not fools. They were professionals, brilliant tacticians, experienced commanders, products of the finest military education in Europe. They understood operational warfare. They understood combined arms. They understood speed and violence of action. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that all of their knowledge had become obsolete. Because World War II was not a continuation of World War I. It was a preview of something new, industrial total war, where victory goes not to the army with the best doctrine, but to the nation with the most efficient resource allocation. The Germans fought a 20th-century war with 19th-century logistics. The Americans fought a 20th-century war with 21st-century supply chain management. And this pattern repeats. In Vietnam, the United States learned that superior logistics cannot compensate for strategic incoherence. In Afghanistan, modern militaries learned that supply dominance means nothing if the enemy refuses to fight on your terms. The lesson evolves but never disappears. Logistics is necessary but not sufficient. You can't supply your way to victory. But you also can't win without supply. The men who drove the Red Ball Express routes, predominantly African-American soldiers, denied frontline combat roles by institutional racism, performed logistics duties that historians now recognize as essential to Allied victory. They received little recognition at the time. No medals for heroism. No parades. Just duty, driving through hostile territory under constant threat of air attack, mechanical failure, and ambush, to ensure that white infantry units at the front remain supplied. This too is a lesson history teaches. The unglamorous work, performed by unseen people, often matters more than the celebrated battles. Supply sergeants win wars while generals receive credit. Truck drivers determine outcomes while politicians claim victory. The machine requires 10,000 invisible hands to function. And when those hands are denied their due recognition, the machine itself is unjust, even when efficient. So what do we take from this? What truth persists beyond the specific circumstances of 1944? Perhaps this: complexity defeats brilliance. A sufficiently robust system, operated with discipline and adequate resources, will outlast even genius-level opposition. The German General Staff, arguably the most intellectually sophisticated military organization of the 20th century, lost to a system of trucks, schedules, and persistent execution. Not because trucks are more impressive than tactics, but because tactics without supply collapse into desperation. This should terrify us, because it means that war, modern industrial war, favors not the just or the brave, but the systematic. The side that can bureaucratize violence most efficiently. The nation that can turn killing into logistics. The civilization that can deliver death at scale without pausing to question whether it should. But it should also humble us. Because if supply determines survival, then every comfortable life in the developed world exists downstream of logistical systems most of us never think about. The food in your refrigerator. The electricity powering this screen. The water flowing from your tap. All of it depends on trucks that never stop, supply chains that never break, and workers you will never meet. The German generals learned this lesson in 1945. They learned it in retreat, in defeat, in the ashes of a regime that promised mastery and delivered ruin. We have the privilege of learning it without that cost. If you're still here, if you've stayed to the end of this story, then you value forgotten truths. You understand that history is not just battles and speeches, but patterns and systems. You recognize that what seems boring often matters most. Keep that awareness alive. Because the engines are silent now. But they could start again. And when they do, it won't be brilliance that saves you. It will be supply.